Hey everybody, I thought it would be a good idea to make a separate video and talk about one of your assignments for the course. So we have a big project, as you know, that comes up and is due at the end of the course. It's called Group-Based Health and Wellness Program Design and Evaluation Project. Whew, that's a mouthful, right? But I thought I would make just something separate here to kind of walk through this in case you have questions. I think it's probably time, if you haven't started thinking about it, to start thinking about it now, and at least getting the ball rolling on ideas and getting some review of literature started on your end. I think maybe just an overall clarification that this is, so as the title says, it's a group-based health and wellness program. And what I mean by group-based in this context is that it's for a group of people. So maybe it's for an employee, an employer setting where it's for the employees. Maybe it's for community members if it's based out of maybe like a YMCA or a community organization. Or maybe it's based out of a clinic, a health clinic of some kind that's targeting a specific population of patients. But regardless of the setting, this is a program put together to help mitigate something. Okay, so it can be, as examples I put in the syllabus, it could be like cardiovascular disease, like how we did for the cardiovascular and diabetes risk reduction program, which there are examples of in your Blue Line site also. There's a couple articles in there that you can look through that give a background about that program, so you can see how we laid it out. In particular, one of those is written very much like how you should go about writing this particular assignment, and I'll talk about that in a second. But there's that cardiovascular and diabetes risk reduction program was the 5-year results were published, and you can see that that publication, and the front part of that publication is really a lot of the formatting that should be done for this project. So anyway, so you can pick like mitigating cardiovascular disease or maybe diabetes, but maybe it's something completely different, something that is of your own interest. And another example might be doing something like we're doing for the food pharmacy program, where we have folks who have type 2 diabetes and are low income, and this is the program that we put together for them. Okay, so hopefully that part makes sense. It's, the clarification comes is this is not a research project. So it's not where you have one group doing this intervention and another group doing this intervention, and you're gonna design some quantitative and qualitative assessments to see the difference between the two groups. It's not necessarily what we're talking about. It is something that you could do if you're interested in doing that, but that's more of a research type project. This is more of a program that you put together for a group of people who, for instance, say have type 2 diabetes, and you want to try to mitigate or manage the type 2 diabetes so that it doesn't progress and worsen. And in this case, what you're doing is collecting baseline data before people would start the program, and then at some interval later, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's all of them, you collect that same data again and compare it back to the baseline data. And in those instances, you can then get differences and run statistical tools and measurements analysis to see if there was a statistical change between what you would say is pre or a baseline versus 6 months or 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or whatever. So there are, in that kind of instance, there are measurements that you could take, say for instance, hemoglobin A1C, to see if there was changes over time. as a result of your project, and what statistical tools make sense to use for that. And that all would be included in the methods section. Okay, so one of the things that hopefully is not confusing is that this isn't necessarily a research project per se, but it is a research like project because you're collecting data and you're comparing it. And so certainly that is research, and research, that type of research is and should be published so that others, if they're interested, can do the same type of thing. When the book talks about research, they're mostly talking about setting up, where you have, for instance, two groups both have type 2 diabetes, and group A is going to have this intervention and group B is going to have this intervention, and you're going to see which, over a certain time period, which intervention was most effective at, say, lowering hemoglobin A1C. That, although you can set something up like that if you want, this isn't that type of project. It's more of a group-based, as I explained, group-based project that perhaps an employer or an organization would be able to adopt as a way to help manage some type of chronic illness. Okay, so in the book, I mentioned there that the write-up for this will follow chapter 4. Okay, so if you've looked at this, what you'll see is that chapter 4, really a lot of this book, but particularly chapter 4, is helpful if you're doing a thesis project in your, say, master's program. That's really what this book was written for. And so chapter 4 in the book gives an idea about what should be included in the first several chapters of a thesis for a master's program. And this is the format that we will follow, chapter 4, for this assignment. Okay, so again, even though this talks about research, paper, and proposal, you are doing research again, but it's not the, comparisons as we might normally think about research. Okay, so in chapter 4, then, it outlines which sections need to be included in your assignment as far as when you turn the assignment in. And those are outlined in the syllabus also. So that would be a project title and your name as the author, an abstract, an introduction, and then a statement of what the problem is and the purpose of the program and the program objectives. And then comes a review of literature. So what do we know about this so far? And then comes, the big piece in the methods. And this, in the methods, is where you talk about the participants in the program, the program itself, the design of it. And so, for instance, in our cardiovascular and diabetes risk reduction program, it outlines what we do in the program and how the progression of the program is. Now, when these things are published in journals, and by the way, this is the first part of, exactly how a journal article would lay out. You don't have to put every little single detail, but enough there so that the reader can understand in a way that if they wanted to try to replicate this, that they would get a pretty good idea. So if somebody says, well, I love your idea, I want to implement that in my medical clinic that I work, and so there's enough information there for them to be able to do that. That's kind of the general idea of this. So the program design piece is part of the methods section. Data collection, so how often is the data being collected and what data is actually being collected is included in that. And then the last part of this is the data analysis. So what statistical tools are you going to use to analyze the data? Okay, so that's where, a little bit of this comes in from, there's all the information you need to answer that question is in the book. And hopefully you'll be able to kind of work through that. And that, perhaps I'm anticipating, might be one of the greatest challenges of this. And as I said many times, when I do something like this, I might have a general idea of what I feel like might be the right tool, but I'm always going to confirm that with someone who does this for real as a job, to know that I'm actually doing the right tool. Because the last thing you want to do is get to the end of your research project and realize that you used the wrong tool, or you collected the data in the wrong way, and that it wasn't set up correctly on the front end, and so then the back end you have unusable data. So that's why it's always worth doing all your homework on the front end. And that's really the reason for Chapter 4, is to make sure everything is set up on the front end correctly before you actually do the data collection and intervention piece. And then finally, in the last piece of this would be what your references are that you use for this. There is no page length to this, as it says in there. So it is as long as makes sense for your paper, and that's how it will be evaluated in that way. So I would say, don't feel like, okay, geez, because he said that I need to make it 50 pages long. You don't need to make it 50 pages long. Whatever makes sense for what you're writing about. And I think that goes along too with the review of literature piece that is part of this, to give the reader some background about the problem and what we know so far and why it's important for this project to be done. That's really the purpose of the review of literature. And so this isn't, if you were writing a review of literature for a thesis paper, ideally it should be exhaustive. So anything that has been ever written about this, so this is ideally for a thesis, not your assignment, that has ever been written about your topic, that you would want to find those articles and review them and see what's pertinent and include them in your thesis. You don't do that for writing a journal article, of course, because there's not enough space. And that's not what you would want to do for this assignment either. You're not writing a thesis for this, certainly not in this course and in 8 weeks. So what do you include in that review of literature? Well, you need enough to give a representative sampling of what we know about it so far. And what's available about this topic so far. What makes sense to include in your project, for instance, because there are, probably thousands of articles that could be included, but what makes sense? What's a representative sample? So there needs to be a few included in there. What's a few? Well, whatever makes sense for you. So is 2 enough? Probably not. Is 10 enough? That might be too much. So somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe, 4 or 5 projects that are closely related, and just writing a short paragraph on what you know and how they, relate to what you're doing. And then ultimately then, if you wanted to fast forward this to, if you were doing this for real, the research of this for real, then you build off of the methods part by actually doing the project, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then that goes in the results section, and then which is not part of this. And then the next section is a discussion section, and that's then where you pull back in that information that you wrote about in your review of literature. So how does what you did in your intervention contribute to the body of knowledge that's out there? Did it fill a gap that is necessary? Were you able to do something in a different way, perhaps a more efficient way, that then leads to similar results? Or were you able to get better results because you implemented a different type of intervention? And so that's all talked about in the discussion section, which is not included in this paper. And then the last piece on when you end up publishing it is on the conclusions part. So what's the take-home message? And where does your research need to go? Where does the research in this area need to go from here? So anyway, that's the the process of doing a project like this, where you develop a group-based program or a research project, where this is how you think through it. You write it up, the initial part. Then you actually do the intervention, and then the follow-up on the end of your discussion and conclusion. So for this class, it just makes sense to do that front part of it. What would your design be? You know, if you could implement any type of program, what might that be? Okay, for some of you, you may actually be working at a place that it makes sense to do something like this for real. So we've had students in the past that have done this in this particular course. So that, you know, this is something that you say, well, I think this is a good opportunity to use my actual work environment and the information I know and that I have access to in the setting. You can all use that as part of your doing it for real. That would make certainly the methods section easier to write because you actually can plan it out for real. Not saying that you certainly have to. If you don't work in an environment, this is something that you just get to create on your own in a setting that makes sense for you. But feel free, if you work in an environment, to use that as an example of something you could implement for real. So hopefully that clarifies this assignment a little bit. And I am just going to double check as I have the syllabus up in front of me that this assignment, is due at the end of the 8th week. So you've got about 3-4 weeks to work on this assignment, and it's due as the last assignment due in the course. So if you have questions, if you want to, talk through any of this with me, if you want to just meet and say, here's my ideas, can you help me refine it? I'm certainly open to that. And I'm going to be happy to help answer any questions or give some guidance where it seems like it makes sense. Good luck on your project. I can't wait to see how they turn out and to see all your great creativity and ideas. Talk to you soon. Thanks.